Hello again. If you've already watched the first two lessons, you're probably wondering, when are we going to get to start writing some code? And the answer is right now. In this video, we're going to talk about events and how to handle events that occur within your application by writing some code. We'll keep the code simple for now by just setting some properties at runtime for the controls on our forms. And over the course of the next 3 or 4 videos, we're going to tack on some more of the C# language for you to include within your applications. So let's get started by talking about events. Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition creates event-driven programs. Now, what is an event-driven program? All that means is that your applications will respond to events. An event could be something as simple as program started, or it could be user clicked button, or user typed a certain key on the keyboard, or any number of interactions between your program and anything that's outside of the program. Now, your users are just one source of events that occur. Windows itself can send messages to your applications like shut down, or data coming in from the internet, so you need to process it. And other programs can trigger events in your applications as well. As I'll demonstrate in just a moment, there are literally hundreds of possible events that your application can react to. Now, I'm oversimplifying events just a little bit here, but I think you can use this as a working definition throughout this lesson series. Once you move on, you start advancing your skills, you're going to begin to realize that there's some neat things that you can do with events. But I'm going to leave that for another time. Let's take a quick look at the Hello World application from Lesson 1, and let's talk about that line of code that we wrote to display a message in a little message box on screen. Now, if you recall what happened in that lesson, I double-clicked the button, and the code view appeared. And at the time when we double-clicked that button, Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition created a template of code for us. And I want to take a few moments to talk about that template of code that it actually created. It named it automatically as private sub button1 underscore click. And there's also some other words that probably don't make a whole lot of sense that come after that. Let's not worry about that for right now. Just understand that this first line defines the beginning of an event handler, and whenever this event is triggered, the code that we type in between that private sub button1 click and at the very bottom, that end sub, whatever we type in between those two lines of code will actually be executed whenever button 1 is clicked by our end user. In this case, we just have one line of code, but it could have easily been 10 lines of code or 100 lines of code, whatever we needed to put in there. Now, what is the significance of the private sub and the end sub words on those lines of code? Well, they define a block of code, or rather a code block, that either works together to accomplish a task. In this case, the task is to handle the button 1 click event, or they work together in order to organize the code. Now, if you look at the very top and the bottom, you see this public class form1 and end class at the very bottom. And they're just another organizational container for right now, an organizational unit that we're going to talk about much later in this series of lessons, I believe in Lesson 6, and when we talk about classes. But for right now, just accept the fact that they're another organizational unit that groups code together. So the code view actually does something kind of neat with these two code blocks that we have here. It allows us to expand and contract these code blocks so that we can move this code out of the way or see how it rolls up. And whenever we roll it up, notice if we hover our mouse cursor over it, this little boxed area, it'll show us a synopsis of the code that's in there. Now, this is just a visual way to help us see distinctively the code blocks and how they are associated. And this will come in handy as we have a lot more code to view within this code area. But just to keep things simple and to recap for now, events happen within your applications, and you write your applications to respond to those events. And events come from a number of different sources. Some of them can be from the user of the application. Some of them can be from other applications such as Windows itself or another app that's running in the current session Windows. And the way you respond to those events is to write code within a code block called an event handler. You can see it here, private sub button 1 click, and all the way down to the end sub line of code. And that's just one way to define a block of code, is through the use of this sub and sub nomenclature. Each block of code has its own name. You can see here it's button1_click. And before we move on, though, I want to introduce a new term. We've called this block of code an event handler, but an event handler is just a type of a more general structure called a method. And we'll be writing and calling, or rather triggering, our own methods in Lesson 6. And 95% of the code that we write will appear within the context of a method. So it's an important building block, and I wanted you to start hearing that term method. So this event handler, private sub, button1_click, is actually known as a method. But let's continue our conversation about event handlers. Like I said earlier, there are hundreds of events that we can write code to handle. The question is, how do you know what other events are available to you? Do you have to memorize hundreds of commands? Well, absolutely not. In Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition, there are actually several different ways to determine which events a particular object, like a control, like a button control, can respond to, and then go on to create an event handler for it. Now, the first and most obvious way was what we did in the first lesson, which was to just double-click on the object in the design view, which creates the default event handler for that particular object. So in the case of the button, the default event handler is a click event. Each control's default event handler will depend on what makes sense for that particular control. But most of the time, the default event handler is at least one of the events that you'll probably want to handle within your application. But what if you need to handle an event that's not the default event? Well, the easiest way to see all the available events for our button control in this case is to select it within our design view, and then to select this little lightning bolt that appears here in our properties window, and we'll see a listing of all of the events that can be handled by our application that will be triggered by interaction with our button. Notice that I'm still looking at my button 1, but in this case I'm looking at all of the events that can occur for that button. So we have the most obvious one, the click event, but we can also handle things like, for example, let's just drag through here. What if we were to enable drag and drop within our applications? Then there's some events that can allow us to work with that. Or the ability for us to detect whenever the current selection is the button. So the user has used the tab button several times, and before they click the button, maybe we want to do a check on the entry that they made within the form and notify them that perhaps they missed a required field without having to pop open a message box and being very obtrusive. Well, we could use these focus events to do that. And you can see they're kind of grouped together, just like the properties are grouped together whenever we're looking at that view. Then also, for example, if somebody were to try to resize or move this button, we can respond to those events, and so on. There's just literally dozens of different events that can be responded to for this given button. Now, most of the time we're only going to want to work with the click or perhaps one or two other events, but in some cases on some controls we may want to enable a number of these events so that we can enable some really rich functionality within our applications. If we want to create, for example, an event handler for whenever the focus has come on our button, then all we need to do is just like double click that particular line within the properties, and notice that we're brought back to our code view for private sub button 1 enter, and now we can write our code just like we did in the example in lesson 1. Now, going back to our form view, if we want to look at our properties again, we just need to select right next to the lightning bolt. We go back to the properties view. So that's how you get back between viewing the properties for a given object, in this case a button, or the events for that same object. You can toggle between these two views of properties and events for that item. Now, the third way to create event handlers is that you can type them in yourself. Now, this is not easy to do at all. In fact, in C# it's much easier to do than in Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition, but it's something that you could do if you had the inclination. We're not going to demonstrate how to do that in this series of videos. The reason is because Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition just does it for you mistake-free, and it allows you to really work through this process of working with events and with objects on your forms very quickly. Speeds up the process of writing applications, so we're not going to worry about anything that would slow us down. So now that we understand more about events, we want to move on to some fun stuff. Let's write some code in those event handlers that do something a little bit more meaningful than just pop up a message that says, "Hello world." In the previous lesson, we looked at how to adjust the properties of an object, like a control or a form, using the Properties window, and we talked about how this is just a shortcut for writing the code ourselves. Now we're going to look at writing code in our event handler methods in order to change a property of an object on our form. So I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to call it Lesson3. So I'm going to go to File, New Project. I'm going to make sure the Windows application template is selected. I'm going to change the name to Lesson03 and click the